This is a summary of the second section of Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Human beings have goals, and we act for ends. But many of these goals come from our desires, and these are relative to individuals. So Kant thinks that these can't serve as the basis for a universal moral law. All that we can get from these kinds of goals are hypothetical imperatives. If you want such and such, do such and such. You should do such and such. So what's the basis of the moral law for Kant? He says in section 428, quote, "Supposing, however, there were something whose existence had in itself an absolute worth, something which, being an end in itself, could be a ground of definite laws, then in this, and in this alone, would lie the ground of a possible categorical imperative." This is section 428. So rational beings, he thinks, have absolute worth. Human beings in particular have absolute worth. He says, quote, in 428, "Rational beings are called persons because their very nature identifies them as ends in themselves. In other words, as something that must not be used merely as means, and to that extent restricts arbitrary choice and is an object of respect." So here we get the idea of respect for persons. So we arrive now at the second formulation of the categorical imperative, sometimes known as the formula of humanity. And it's stated in section 429 as the following, quote, "Act so as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means." And he uses the same examples to illustrate this formula. He uses the same examples that he used in the first section. And these are the following. First, suicide. We have a necessary duty to oneself. That is, not to treat oneself as merely a means to an end. And suicide is treating oneself as a means to an end. The second one is false promises. We have a necessary duty to others, not to treat them as means to an end, and lying to them treats them as means to an end. Talents, number 3. We have a meritorious duty to cultivate our own talents. Number 4, helping others attain their ends. He says there's a meritorious duty to do this, not only to protect others, not violate their human dignity, but also to a positive duty to help them realize their ends. So what's the difference between necessary duties and meritorious duties? Well, necessary duties are perfect duties. These are absolute and apply in every situation. Meritorious duties, on the other hand, are imperfect duties. So they are obligations that we have, but they're flexible, and so how they apply may vary. How or when they apply may vary. If you want to learn more about perfect and imperfect duties and what Kant thinks about them, you can see sections 421 and 424. So we now arrive at the third formulation of the categorical imperative, called the formula of autonomy. This comes from sections 431 and 432. So it doesn't explicitly appear in the text, but there's an article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entitled Kant's Moral Philosophy that articulates it this way. Quote, "Act so that through your maxims you could be a legislator of universal laws." So it's not enough for Kant to just be a rule follower. It's not enough for Kant just to follow the moral law or just be subject to the moral law. To follow a moral law means to follow it on the basis of some kind of inclination, which would make morality a type of hypothetical imperative. And Kant says in 433, to obey the law because of attraction or constraint is not to obey it freely. So what gives human beings their worth and dignity is freedom. But by freedom, Kant doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. For him, freedom is something very particular. It means the ability to self-legislate, to be a law to oneself. So this means you have the ability, on the basis of your reason, to will your own your principle of action, to will it to become a universal law for everyone else. And this would mean that you are not a slave to your inclinations. You are not a slave to nature like an animal. You are a rational human being. So this universalizing, this idea of universalizing your own maxim means that you're not the only one, that you're not the only rational person out there. In fact, we find ourselves as part of a community of rational beings, all who are autonomous in this way. So this brings us to the fourth formulation of the categorical imperative, or the kingdom of ends. Now, the third and the fourth, some people combine the third and the fourth formulations into one and just call it the kingdom of ends. And you can find the formulation of the kingdom of ends in 439. It states, quote, act in accordance with maxims of a member legislating universal laws for a merely possible kingdom of ends. A merely possible just means an ideal. So this brings us into a social dimension. So this brings the categorical imperative into a social dimension. We have now rational beings as part of a community of fellow legislators that all work together in this kingdom of end, in this society. So that's about it. I hope you find that that's helpful.